And we're recording.
Great. I'm Woody Register. I'll introduce myself. I'm Woody Register, the director of the Roberson Project here at Sewanee, and also a professor of history. We will give folks another couple of minutes before we start tonight's presentation, where I begin with my introduction to tonight's presentation. So we'll give people a couple of minutes. And Professor Jones, it is okay if we video record this?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I believe we're calling that asynchronous these days.
Okay.
You tape it and then people can go back to it later.
Yes, that is a word I have added to my vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to think it just meant I wasn't on time, but
I like that use of it.
so I have a few seconds after 7:30, so we'll start at 7:32. How about that?
Okay, sounds good.
I gather everyone is looking at our small talk and faces at this point. Oh, good. We have 48. Okay, I guess we'll begin. Thank you all out there for joining us tonight. I see we have more than 50 participants. That's a good sign. So allow me to introduce myself again. I'm Woody Register. I'm the director of the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation here at Sewanee, the University of the South. And it's my pleasure tonight to make a few introductory remarks before our presentation from Professor Kelly Houston Jones. As many people in our audience probably know, Leonidas Polk is in the headlines again at Sewanee. And he has belonged in the headlines for quite some time, but unfortunately, it took a particular incident to bring him to the attention of the larger Sewanee community. But back in the 1950s, Leonidas Polk's name was on people's minds and on their tongues, as a fact. In the 1950s, and to mark the first century of the University of the South, and the completion, finally, of its All Saints Chapel, the spiritual center of the campus. A Sewanee alumnus from 1920, William Dudley Gale III of Nashville, prominent wealthy businessman there, donated the funds for one of the today's glories of the Sewanee campus, the 56 bell Carillon, which is perched in Shepherd Tower, newly constructed with the completion of the chapel. And the Carillon is perched some 100 and plus feet above the floor of the campus. And this Carillon, Gale dedicated in the name of his great-grandfather, Leonidas Polk, the first Episcopal bishop of Louisiana, the preeminent founder of the University of the South, and the man who rose to the rank of lieutenant general in the Confederate Army until his battlefield death in 1964. So if you walk outside All Saints Chapel today to the base of the tower facing the McClurg Dining Hall, you'll see an unpretentious plaque that brings together in a very powerful fusion of Christianity, the Episcopal Church, the University, and the Confederacy. And this plaque reads, "To glorify God, to Bishop General Leonidas Polk, and to Sewanee, my alma mater, this Carillon is dedicated. William Dudley Gale III, class of 1920." And at the dedication of the Carillon, one of Gale's classmates from 1920, a professor of English literature and noted philologist named A. Cabell Greet, he was on the faculty at Barnard College. He was the chosen orator for the 1959 commencement when the Carillon bells were rung. And Greet made this remarkable pronouncement. He said, "After Alfred the Great, there has lived no one man who achieved such stature in the fields of religion, of the military, and of education as Leonidas Polk." So I'm a historian, I do US history. So even I had to look to Wikipedia to figure out just when Alfred the Great was last stalking the planet. And it turns out he died in the year 899. So that, according to Professor Greet, means that more than 900 years had passed before Alfred the Great had met his equal in Leonidas Polk. So this gives you some idea of the esteem, I guess you might say, that Polk was held in the minds of Sewanee men in the 1950s. Now today, the name or face of Leonidas Polk can be found at the base of Shepherd Tower in various spots within the All Saints Chapel itself, including the apse holding the high altar, and until a few weeks ago, in the lobby of the DuPont Library, beneath a small sculpted head that had been in that prominent location for longer than anyone can remember. And in all of these places and instances, we get the same message: God, the Episcopal Church, the University of the South, and the Confederacy. Nowhere except in the deepest recesses of the university's special collections will you find any commemoration of Leonidas Polk as a planter of cotton and sugarcane and an enslaver of hundreds of Black women, men, and children over the course of his life. This erasure on our campus of the central and life-defining dimensions of the life of Leonidas Polk as one of the Southern region's major wheelers and dealers in the commodities of land, cotton, sugar, and human chattel, and as a self-proclaimed Christian master of these hundreds of Black people whom God, in his words, had placed in his hands for their religious uplift and protection. You can search all of this campus's many memorials to Leonidas Polk and find no information, no insight into these defining elements of his life. And that gap, that erasure, is the reason, one of the principal reasons, we have invited Professor Kelly Houston Jones to speak to us tonight, to help us understand the vast business enterprises in real agricultural and human property of the Polk family network, which included the 11th President of the United States, James K. Polk, and the first Episcopal bishop of Louisiana, Leonidas Polk. And it extended from North Carolina to Tennessee to the old Southwest agricultural boom regions of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. The Polks, as Professor Jones will tell us, I predict, were not just the passive beneficiaries of these agricultural boom times. They were among the leading engineers in it, among the leading profiters from it. And that is why we have asked her to join us tonight. Professor Jones is assistant professor of history at Arkansas Tech University, where she teaches the history of slavery with a special focus on the brutal conditions of enslavement for the captive Black people whose labor transformed the region on the western edge of the South, Arkansas, into a productive outpost of the empire of cotton. She has published articles on white fear of Black rebellion in the mid-19th century, on bondswomen, on Arkansas's cotton frontier, and on lynching and slaves in antebellum Arkansas. I'm also happy to announce that her first book, A Weary Land, Slavery on the Ground in Arkansas, this brings a smile to all of our faces, right? Has been published this year, just very recently, by the University of Georgia Press. And congratulations to Professor Jones for that. According to the book notes, A Weary Land is the first book-length study of slavery in Arkansas in more than 60 years. And it allows us to see enslaved life, including how in clearing the forests, cultivating cotton, and tending livestock, the enslaved farmers of Arkansas connected culture and nature, creating their own meanings of space, place, and ultimately freedom. Finally, you will also find her research, from which tonight's talk is taken, in the volume James K. Polk and His Time, which is forthcoming from the University of Tennessee Press. Her talk tonight is entitled The Polks Network and the Business of Slavery in the Old Southwest. Welcome virtually to Sewanee, Professor Jones.
Thank you. I am so happy to be involved. And I'm going to pause for just a second and let someone wave at me if my sound isn't good. It looks like we're good. I brought a short PowerPoint, just a handful of images. And so I'm going to see if it will let me share this with you. I think I'm seeing success. So thanks so much for having me. And I would like to begin with the admission that I'm a bit of a Polk poser. I came to research on the Polk family and business network via my research on the history of slavery in Arkansas. That research led me to some questions about absentee slaveholding. One of the things I noticed was that there were several people who, in the very elite group of slaveholders, who invested in plantations in Arkansas, but who were reluctant to actually move to this place that they thought of, and many people still do think of, as just sort of the edge of the civilized world. And so I had a grad student who I hope is in the Zoom audience, and if not, I'll send him a video later and make him be involved in this. I had a grad student who had worked at the James K. Polk Home and Museum, and he said, James K. Polk was a absentee slaveholder, and I had just never really thought about it before. Polk really wasn't on my radar, and so the more I dug, the more I found more Polks and more Polks and more Polks, and just a really essential network for, like you said in the introduction, an active creation of the empire, the cotton empire of the old Southwest. And so that's sort of what brought me into this. And I have, in the last handful of years, had to keep sort of a cheat sheet on the Polk family tree to try to keep all of these people straight. So what I'd like to do is kind of use James K. Polk and Sarah Childress Polk as a bit of a touchstone to get us into this network, how it worked, who's involved. I'll turn to talking with you about how enslaved people complicated that, and then we'll end on, James and Sarah Polk again. James K. and Sarah Childress Polk, their family plantation enterprise in Tennessee and in Mississippi made up just one branch of this massive Polk kin and business network that helped to drive the creation of the Old Southwest. Some of these planners chose to relocate to the sites of their investments in Arkansas, Mississippi, northern Louisiana, while many others administered their plantations from the comfort of older southern towns like Columbia, Tennessee. I'll turn you to Tennessee map here. Polk and his compatriots performed their wealth at a home base and extended their portfolios into the southern frontier and looked after each other's interests. The enslaved people they held did not make it easy for planners like the Polks, who constantly struggled to keep their operations managed, supplied, and free of runaways. A web of business, family, and political relationships protected the Polks and other speculators and slaveholders in the Old Southwest. Several small southern cities can be counted among those who served as launching pads from which networks of planter families speculated and invested in the western parts of the South. But Columbia, in particular, in Murray County, Tennessee, propelled many of those Middle Tennessee region's old Southwest planters. Early Indian removal laid the foundation for the creation of Middle Tennessee towns like Columbia, which was incorporated in 1817. Residents there enjoyed a connection to the region's commerce via the Duck River. They had access to frequent stages, and by the 1840s, the Natchez Trace connected the Nashville area down through Mississippi's cotton frontier. So it's a good spot. The area farmers practiced a pretty diverse agriculture, and they included cotton, tobacco, and the region's rich soil supported just about whatever they wanted to put their hands to. Columbia was the family and economic seat of many of the Tennessee Polks, and it incubated a wealthy class of slaveholding farmers who kept ties with their kinship roots in the East, the Carolinas, while extending their economic and political reach to the South and West. An early and successful pioneer of the planter network radiating out of Columbia and Murray County was James K. Polk's uncle, William Wilson Polk. He was James's father, Samuel's brother, the brother of James K. Polk's father. The family referred to him as Stingy Bill. Stingy Bill chose to leave Murray County for Hardeman County, Tennessee, and by 1836, he had gone even further westward to Phillips County, Arkansas. One son, John Jackson Polk, remained in Hardeman County, Tennessee, kept his own cotton plantation near Hickory Valley. A resident planter, William Polk amassed more than 900 acres in Arkansas. In 1845, his taxable property there included at least 120 enslaved people. He accumulated esteem as well as wealth in Arkansas. In 1844, after someone disputed his father's, which would be James K. Polk's grandfather's, military record, he wrote to an Arkansas newspaper to defend the reputation of all Polks. In addition to that family loyalty, James K. Polk benefited from his uncle's growing wealth. According to James's correspondence, Stingy Bill was much more generous than his nickname suggests. He lent the president-elect $9,000 in January 1845, and that's about $250,000 today. In return, William desired an appointment for his son Thomas N. Polk as receiver of public monies at Springfield, Missouri, which he's not going to get. That massive sum of money that the older Polk contributed to his famous nephew's future had been generated, of course, by wealth in land and enslaved families in Phillips County, Arkansas. The mini empire that William Wilson Polk had created in the Old Southwest and passed down to his descendants was just one thread of a deeply entrenched and growing network of Polk kinship ties that increasingly stretched westward. William Julius Polk and his children also extended their investments into the cotton frontier as a family affair. Maybe they were inspired by their cousin Stingy Bill's success. William Julius's grandfather and James K. Polk's grandfather were brothers. William Julius was the half-brother of Leonidas Polk and some other siblings that we'll talk about. A member of this older generation of Polks who helped create the western wing of the Polk plantation domain, William Julius Polk was born in North Carolina. He married Mary Rebecca and moved to Murray County, Tennessee, becoming the president of the Columbia branch of the Bank of Tennessee. By 1860, William and his sons, Lucius Eugene, Thomas Gilchrist, and Allen Jones, all had amassed large holdings there. His son, Lucius Eugene Polk, was raised in Columbia, and after he graduated from the University of Virginia in 1852, moved out to St. Francis Township, Phillips County, Arkansas. Allen became one of the most successful planters following part-time resident model of sometimes living in Columbia, Tennessee, living at other times in North Carolina, in Kentucky, Mississippi, and Arkansas. One of his operations in Tunica County, Mississippi, grew to rely on the labor of 200 enslaved people. Across the river in Arkansas, he held 78 bondspeople there in Phillips County. Allen eventually set roots in Arkansas and attained a powerful place in its planter society. After his first wife died, he married Anna Fitzhugh Clark of Kentucky and then added her wealth to his fortune. By the census of 1860, shortly after his marriage, Allen Polk held a whopping $100,000 in personal estate and $50,000 in real estate in Arkansas. He lived in Phillips County with his family by then, and they were clearly investing in that property to establish it as their long-term home, as evidenced by the census population schedule showing 8 master carpenters on site and a brick mason. William Julius's brother and Leonidas's brother, Thomas, remained in North Carolina, but he invested westward for preparing for later settlement. He served in the North Carolina State Legislature, sat as president of a local auxiliary chapter of the American Colonization Society, which is kind of it's sort of an odd connection, was elected Major General of a division of the state militia, and then he ended his career in the 1830s as a trustee of the University of North Carolina. After he built his career in North Carolina, Thomas finally began a comfortable retirement at Holly Springs, Mississippi plantation, which worked 80 bondspeople by 1840. Thomas served as an example of how successful the planter public figure route could be for Polks moving westward. The practice of investing in Western plantations from afar rather than settling them helped the Polks prosper and spread their investment throughout the Mississippi Valley. George Washington Polk and Leonidas Polk, for example, they lived in Leonidas for a while, nestled in their neighborhood of estates in Murray County outside Columbia, while George held 88 bondspeople growing cotton in Chico County, Arkansas. Leonidas invested in sugar in Bayou Fourche, Louisiana, among other places, and then he's later, as you guys know, going to move out to Louisiana. George's marriage to Sally Hilliard of Chico County, Arkansas, plugged him right into a large, prosperous planter family of Southeast Arkansas. One more sibling here, Susan Polk, sister of Leonidas, married a man named Kenneth Rayner, a wealthy planter who held a Chico County, Arkansas plantation, but kept a more permanent presence in North Carolina. And the story suggests that Susan Polk Rayner did not want to move to Arkansas. She would rather sort of, I think supposedly she said something like she's not going any further than Memphis. So Kenneth Rayner comes out part of the time and partly not. The Rayners were very proud of the Polk name. Susan and Kenneth gave it as a middle name to 6 of their 8 children. Some of that's that they're proud of that Polk money too, right? Sort of keep that legacy going. And I've got a little something to share with you a bit later on that. The whole family, the whole Polk family, used its network to handle its business affairs. In 1852, Leonidas wrote from his Louisiana plantation to Kenneth Rayner, that's his sister's husband, his brother-in-law, in North Carolina, for assistance in securing his wife, Frances Ann Devereaux Polk's inheritance of half of her father's enslaved people in North Carolina. As per the will, the enslaved people were to be split evenly between Frances and her brother, Thomas Devereaux. Leonidas requested his brother-in-law, Rayner, to act on his behalf and to, quote, see the equitable division of those slaves between the siblings, as well as their transports to the Trans-Mississippi. On that last point, he wrote that it would be fine either to ship the group to New Orleans or send them overland via the railroad. Quote, you can know of all these things better than I, Leonidas trusted. Doubtless Negroes are being sent from North Carolina this way continually. I have to say that it is, of course, important to have them at as little expense as possible. Frances, his wife, followed up with a letter to Rayner, furnishing him specific details about the inheritance and her own editorial on what a boon the addition of the bondspeople would be to the Polk's Louisiana sugar plantation. These Negroes will be very valuable, she explained. Refining could be carried on very extensively and, of course, profitably with their aid. The crop of cane planted this year will be 284 acres. As Mr. Polk has made his arrangements in the refinery for these Negroes, it is important that they should be here soon. Frances and Leonidas' son, Alexander Hamilton Polk, who I guess people usually just called him Hamilton, someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that, continued the family's expansion of acreage and enslaved labor as absentee. In 1860, he held at least a few large operations in Bolivar County, Mississippi, and at least one of those, it's not quite clear, but at least one of those is a joint investment with somebody named Bowles. But it seems as if Alexander Hamilton Polk spent most of his time in North Carolina. Back to Columbia, the planter network, folks like James K. Polk, a lot of those folks chose to keep their home base in Columbia, stick around there, and invest westward. Gideon Pillow is one of those. I've got a Gideon Pillow photo here. One of the more famous ones of those. Gideon Pillow was James K. Polk's friend, and he was a loyal political ally for years. His family had been connected to Columbia since its founding. He and his brothers, Granville and Jerome, held plantations in Murray County. Pillow graduated from the University of Nashville in 1827, passed the bar, and in 1830 began a practice in Columbia. He and James K. Polk practiced law in the same place for several years before becoming political allies. Pillow began his many years of supporting Polk by assisting him in his 1833 congressional race. He continued to sing Polk's praises, hoping to boost his own political fortunes in the process. But Pillow's plantations would fare better than his political career, even as a friend of James K. Polk's. He looked after his interests in these locales, and he also primed the ground for Polk support. By 1836, he and his brother Granville had invested in 320 acres on the cotton frontier in Phillips County, again, Phillips County, Arkansas, but neither had moved out to the Trans-Mississippi to develop it. Like Polk, Pillow set his domestic roots in Murray County and performed his wealth and status there. In addition to owning a home in town, in 1838, Pillow began constructing a large 2-story brick home on a place he called Clifton. It's a few miles west of Columbia on Polk family land. There's sort of a Polk complex out there. Completed in 1839, the house included 12 rooms and 2 halls and welcomed visitors with a columned portico. By contrast, the 35 enslaved people who labored on the 735-acre plantation inhabited log cabins. They tended hogs, sheep, cattle, and corn. By the mid-1840s, Pillow had secured a contract to produce hemp for the U.S. Navy, boosting expansion of his holdings in land and chattel at Clifton. He lived in this neighborhood of wealthy planters near Leonas's Ashwood plantation before he sold that, which was right across the road from Clifton. Lucius Junius Polk built Hamilton Place right there in 1832. His and Leonas's brother Rufus K. Polk built one called Westbrook in 1840, and George W. Polk, the other brother, built Rattle and Snap in 1845. James K. Polk and his friends in Columbia welcomed these developments, which reinforced their economic and political network. Pillow threw his support behind James's 1839 gubernatorial run, campaigning hard to deliver Middle Tennessee. In turn, Pillow and Polk's other connections prospered with Polk as governor. Pillow, his 2 brothers, and James's brother-in-law, James Walker, were among the 6 people granted state charters during Polk's governorship to build a turnpike under the auspices of the Columbia Central Turnpike Company. Walker had his hands in all kinds of ventures, including his own West Tennessee plantation. James K. Polk, in turn, relied on Walker's connections and efforts, as well as Gideon Pillow's. They're scratching each other's backs. Pillow became the 6th largest slaveholder in Arkansas. He spends a lot of time traveling between Tennessee to Arkansas to check on the progress of his plantation there that he called Mound Plantation. In the mid-1850s, he routinely stayed there a few months out of the year, and he also used that time in Arkansas to cultivate political support and political connections. His son, Gideon Jr., was probably involved in the administration of this plantation as well. That's probably where Gideon Jr. was headed when he was killed, along with several other people in a steamboat explosion on the Mississippi near Helena, Arkansas. Pillow leveraged his profits to expand and enhance that lavish home base, Clifton, back in Columbia, Tennessee. His efforts made him the 3rd largest slaveholder in Tennessee by 1816. And he's traveling all over the country to get financing for this. To get specifically to James K. Polk and Sarah Childress Polk, they need to be understood, of course, as part of this network. Polk corresponded with his cousins about politics, about family matters, as well as about his prospects for land purchases and other business. He inherited enslaved people from his father and his brothers. Sarah Childress Polk brought enslaved people as property into the marriage. Polk first invested in a cotton plantation near Somerville in Fayette County, Tennessee in 1831, never residing at the site nor intending to. Not yet governor of Tennessee, much less president of the United States, he then held a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He set up the Tennessee plantation with 7 enslaved people he already held, 5 more he had recently purchased, and others that he rented from family members. Polk's desire to generate a solid income for himself and for Sarah with the Tennessee plantation was disappointed. The operation never really flourished, but rather than giving up, he's going to turn his attention to Mississippi. Cotton prices stabilized, then they rose after a brief slump that depressed the Tennessee venture for James K. Polk. Whites, meanwhile, effectively pushed the Choctaw out of their lands in northern Mississippi. Polk received reports of the profitability of cotton lands there, and he knew his cousins were already taking the plunge. As his cousins began building their stately planter home base neighborhood outside of Columbia, James was also prepared for a different kind of expansion. In late 1835, he sold the Tennessee plantation in order to buy, and this is in a deal with his brother-in-law, Silas Caldwell, his other brother-in-law, a plantation of more than 900 acres in Yalobusha County, Mississippi. In November 33, his brother-in-law, Idley Harris, had reported that Polk's cousins Lucius and the doctor, which is William Julius, had gone to Mississippi to lay out a place to send their hands and intend planting there the next season. They will make a partnership farm. Polk decided the time was right to prepare the relocation of his enslaved workforce from West Tennessee to Yalobusha County in his own partnership. In 1836, his younger brother, William H. Polk, purchased his brother-in-law's share. So there's always a lot of wheeling and dealing that goes on. Though James and Sarah had long relied on slavery to support their lifestyle, and James continually expanded their holdings, James K. Polk preferred not to advertise his role as a slaveholder while his political fortunes rose. Much of his buying and selling occurred via intermediaries due to convenience. But in later years, as Polk became increasingly concerned about his image as a slaveholder, he often enlisted his wife Sarah in the unseemly business of buying and selling enslaved people on his behalf. Polk preferred to distance himself from this facet of mastery because some of the public might criticize his business in slaves. It's worth noting here that it might seem weird for someone to be a slaveholder, but to be embarrassed about being, trading, wheeling and dealing in people as property. But there was this sort of cultural hangup that even slaveholders had, where they enjoyed benefiting from the institution of slavery, but it was seen as a bit crass to be wheeling and dealing, or to be seen outright wheeling and dealing in enslaved people. It was the slave traders sort of become kind of like a scapegoat. And so these folks preferred to think of themselves as like a gentleman paternalist rather than these sort of like crude traders in human wares. Gideon Pillow even defended Polk when the Albany Argus ran a story mentioning Polk's slaveholding. He's trying to replace any image of Polk as a profit-hungry slave trader with one of Polk as a paternalist. In doing so, Pillow emphasized that Polk had inherited his bondspeople and that Pillow only knew him to have purchased one or two slaves. In one case, it was merely to keep a family from being separated. Gideon Pillow knew better. Later, as president, Polk aggressively expanded his speculation in bondspeople via agents such as his brother-in-law, John Childress, who would then discreetly transfer ownership to Polk in order to keep the purchases as unknown as possible to the public. Polk's letters arranging these purchases repeatedly stressed the need for his agents not to reveal who they were buying for. According to William Dusenberry, who is the recognized authority on James K. Polk as a slaveholder, he did a meticulous analysis of Polk's finances, and according to his findings, Polk invested his surplus money from his federal salary in U.S. Treasury certificates instead of in additional enslaved people, because he clearly felt uneasy about the idea of using his presidential salary to expand his slave holdings. He invested any other profit, though, from his other ventures right back into the plantation and into humans as property. In the early years, Polk's investment in enslaved people wasn't as aggressive because his ventures had not paid off quite so much just yet. He poured his hopes and resources in the Mississippi operation, though. Like the Tennessee plantation, it was supposed to be a portfolio investment. The Polks did not intend to set roots there. James Polk would have preferred, in fact, to focus his mental energy during the 1830s on his rising political career. And so I want to turn here to an enslaved man named Jack, who has other ideas. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how enslaved people are pushing back, against this system. Jack, who is sometimes referred to in the records as Chunky Jack, he's about 45 years old. He frustrated Polk's plans. According to William Dusenberry, Jack's recalcitrance might have contributed to Polk's decision to move the gang further south in the first place, from that Tennessee plantation down to Mississippi, but it's not quite clear. Technically, James K. Polk's little brother owned Jack, but he was a minor, and so James K. Polk, for all practical purposes, owns Chunky Jack. But of course, he doesn't have very good control over what Jack is doing. On these absentee held operations, enslaved people like Jack, they're contending day to day with overseers rather than the people whose names are on the bill of sale. In November 1833, at the end of the crop season, Ephraim Beanland, the overseer, took over on Polk's Tennessee plantation. They haven't moved yet to Mississippi. By the end of the year, Jack had begun testing Beanland, the new overseer. Beanland immediately proved a harsher manager than his predecessor had been. One evening, after forcing the enslaved people to harvest cotton and press the bales until 11 p.m., Beanland forbade the enslaved people from quitting for the day and retiring to their cabins until they had spent additional time shucking corn. Late nights obviously added to the burden of enslaved people's work. When it was discovered that a nearby store had been broken into and robbed, Beanland accused Jack and another enslaved man named Ben of doing this. Perhaps they had lashed out in their frustration about the late hours. Maybe they were looking to supplement the meager rations on the plantation. Maybe they were innocent. Either way, Beanland laid 200 lashes into Jack's back, intermittently salting his flesh to increase the pain. Jack confessed during this torture. For his part, Ben received 100 lashes. The next morning, both men fled. To avoid the overseer and instead appeal to the Polk family directly for protection and redress, Ben knew exactly where to go. He headed to Columbia. Upon arrival, he boldly declared to James K. Polk's family that he would not return to Beanland at the Fayette County plantation, and he got away with it. Polk's brother-in-law in Columbia, Adlai O. Harris, counseled Polk that they probably could lock Ben up and force him to go back out to the plantation, but Ben would certainly run away again. So Harris took the liberty of hiring Ben to a nearby ironworks for $100 a year, which would, go straight into James K. Polk's pocket. Polk's other brother-in-law, Walker, headed out in March to try to get a handle on things at the Somerville plantation. Declaring, quote, "Your Negroes must be put under discipline," he pledged, "I will consider your affairs as my own." Whereas Ben had turned east, gambling, in this case correctly, that relentless resistance might save him from having to deal with Beanland, Jack headed west toward Arkansas Territory. This is a place that has been dubbed the Morass by historian Joshua Rothman because the region was covered with wild, uncultivated terrain, and it was feared by white residents of Tennessee and Mississippi for its reputation as a den of criminals. That made it a draw for investors, including the Polks, who sought fertile and affordable acreage, but it also offered cover that enslaved people could exploit. For some years, this area remained a bit of the western version of the Great Dismal Swamp that harbored runaways in the east, in Virginia and North Carolina. Men and women who fled their enslavers hid in the woods during the day, emerging at night to seize provisions, including hogs, and they would slaughter them at their hideouts to have some provision. They disrupted business partnerships, divided property holders, and prompted men to close ranks. All in all, undermining white mastery and enabling some Black agency on the cotton frontier. So this is where Jack goes. A man named Hughes spotted him and overtook him with some white men who seems to have sort of kidnapped him about 80 miles south of Memphis. Hughes seems to have been in the business of recapturing enslaved people and collecting payment from exasperated slaveholders. Sort of think of him as a bounty hunter kind of guy. He happened upon Jack's group while he was in pursuit of some other people. He saw Jack in chains, and so he became suspicious and thought, well, maybe these guys have, came upon Jack when he ran away and then, captured him. Hughes apprehended these men at a hut on the riverbank, and he took them to the jail in Helena before demanding a $140 fee from Polk's representatives who came out there to try to find Jack. Caldwell relayed all of this information to Polk in Washington with the suggestion that Jack should be sold in Arkansas if a fair price could be had. Jack had shown himself to just be too much trouble. This arrangement would preserve Polk's investment, but also rid him of the resistant Jack. Polk didn't do this. Recapturing Jack proved not only inconvenient, but also expensive. After finally confirming where Jack had gone, he had to arrange transportation for his representatives to travel to Helena. He had to settle with the jailer, who not only was entitled to a fee, but was also, this recapture required the presence of 2 men to vouch for Polk's ownership of Jack. Polk also had to pay a $150 bounty to Hughes. Finally, Polk owed Moore, another guy who helps him out, nearly $100 for his trouble. Beeland, the overseer's letters to Polk about the whole affair include a detailed list of expenses incurred while going to the Arkansas and back, including Jack's 75-cent tavern bill. Jack had cost Polk more than 1/3 of his entire value as chattel in one act of resistance. However annoying to him at the moment, the effort and expense that Polk sank into recapturing Jack made financial sense in the long term on this increasingly profitable cotton frontier. Neither Jack's resistance and other bonds, the resistance of Jack or other bondspeople, nor the weaknesses of Beeland are going to discourage Polk from going forward with this Mississippi operation. He committed to it in hopes for a high return in the long run. About this transition from the Tennessee to the Mississippi plantation, James K. Polk declared in a letter to his wife, Sarah, quote, "I am determined to make more money or lose more, one." Jack returned to the Tennessee plantation just as Polk and his brother-in-law Caldwell were preparing to launch the Mississippi plantation. But it was only a matter of weeks before Jack again attempted to flee. This time he got into a fierce brawl with Beeland. According to Beeland's account, Jack had started off the place with Beeland in pursuit. Jack carried a stick that Beeland didn't originally notice, and then Jack turns and uses it to fight Beeland off, hitting him over the head 3 times. Beeland in turn stabbed Jack twice. He had weakened Jack enough to be able to secure him with chains on the plantation and prevent further resistance. The overseer reported the incident to Polk, including Jack's incensed declaration. Jack, quote, "swears he will never stay with the Polk family anymore." Beeland insisted, however, that he would have Jack back to work in a few days. An altercation like this had been inevitable. White observers had reported that Beeland, the overseer, seemed especially harsh. The captive labor force was determined to get his word in against him. They complained about Beeland's brutality to Polk's representatives when they would come by the plantation. Caldwell, his brother-in-law, wrote to James K. Polk, quote, "Your Negroes are very much dissatisfied. Some others spoke of running away." And he says about Beeland, quote, "I think he lacks stability. I think he's got along badly with the Negroes. The Negroes say he likes liquor, but let that rest as Negro news. If it is the fact, it will appear." And so the enslaved people on Polk's plantation succeeded ultimately in undermining Beeland's employment. His days working for James K. Polk were numbered, not because Polk took pity on the people he held in slavery, but because he eventually became convinced that they were getting the better of Beeland, and so that's cutting into his profits. Jack, for his part, he's gone again. By September 1834, James K. Polk wrote to Sarah from the Tennessee plantation while he's preparing to sell it that Jack had been away for nearly 3 weeks. In Polk's reckoning, Jack had absconded, quote, "without any known cause." Polk feared more trouble among the enslaved people on the place if they found out that they were going to be moved to Mississippi. He urged Sarah Polk not to mention it to the bondspeople in Columbia, acknowledging, without meaning to, the power of the news network between enslaved people held by the Polks. He also worried about where in the world Jack had gone and speculated, "I fear he has taken another trip to the Mississippi River." And he was right about that. Jack had gone back to Arkansas Territory. He witnessed firsthand the ability of fugitives of all types to disappear in that region, at least temporarily, and he decided it was worth trying to return. He was captured in Helena again. He must have cost Polk at least a fee to the sheriff again, and Polk finally decided that it was prudent to sell him. Now, this is important to think about because Polk sold Jack not only because he had caused such inconvenience and expense, but also because he was catching the attention of others. The white families neighboring Polk's Tennessee plantation complained that the presence of such a resistant enslaved man threatened their own safety and their own mastery. Jack's repeated resistance forced an uncomfortable Polk to have to smooth things over. One of his neighbors, Parson Reeves, claimed that if Jack ever showed up in the neighborhood, he would kill him. Reeves claimed that Jack's influence on his blacksmith, Phil, had actually devalued Phil. Enslaved men with training like blacksmithing or carpentry routinely commanded higher prices from slavers, something that those who dealt in humans as commodities really counted on. But high prices only applied to enslaved men who did not carry a reputation for resistance, especially flight. Reeves, the neighbor, asserted that under normal circumstances, he wouldn't take less than $1,000 for Phil. But since Phil had become a known runaway, because he headed off to Arkansas Territory with Jack like twice, now he was worth far less than that usual $1,000. James K. Polk's inability to control an enslaved man had reduced the profits of a slaveholder neighboring his operation. Put another way, resistant enslaved men had undermined their slavers' profits. According to Beeland, Reeves was not the only area slaveholder troubled by Jack's presence. Beeland pleaded with Polk, "I want you to sell Jack and never let him come here no more, for there is a great many of the neighbors is afraid for him to come here." Appeasing Reeves, the neighbor, on James K. Polk's behalf, Beeland bargained and purchased Phil for Polk from Reeves for $600. Polk, the guy who hated to be connected to the buying and selling of enslaved people unless necessary, felt forced to buy Reeves' blacksmith and to sell another man because Jack persisted in fleeing. When James K. Polk died in June 1849 in Nashville, he left 56 enslaved people to Sarah. James had carefully managed this part of their investment portfolio, which was intended to support the couple's lifestyle after Polk's retirement from public service. Actually, here they are. I forgot to show them to you. And it's also supposed to sustain them in their new life as retirees, okay, in this freshly built, beautiful, large Nashville home. Polk's investments had paid off. The Mississippi plantation consistently generated 10 to 13% profits. Now alone, Sarah Polk had to support herself with its proceeds. She's corresponded monthly with the overseer, navigating the difficulties of provisioning the plantation and making choices about marketing the cotton and other matters, all from Nashville. By historian Amy Greenberg's account, Sarah Polk managed the plantation well, despite difficulties in, being distant and having to do it from afar. Sarah Polk managed the operation without a feature that just years and years of scholarship on the history of American slavery has made a staple for understanding the role of the plantation mistress, and that is the big house. The construct had little to no meaning on absentee-owned plantations because the planter family didn't reside on site. There is no white domestic sphere upon which the free white family could perform their status as masters. An overseer lived there, sometimes with a wife and children, but his role was always to maximize profit, to try to get next year's contract, not to set up the performance of status. There's no white family on the grounds to display their wealth and refinement and perform benevolence, okay, for guests at parties or anything like that. There's little to no domestic work required on a plantation like that, so you're not going to have a real division between field and housework on those places. Even more exclusively than usual, enslaved people were there to work the crop. In the daily politics of space, fields and quarters were the most important. And I'm saying all of this to say that Sarah Polk's plantation was truly a factory in the field. The bulk of the formal power to build this empire of the Old Southwest and all of those connections that make that work might have lain in the hands of men, but the Polk women clearly were involved, contributors and beneficiaries of the business kinship system, even if it's more difficult for them to have an openly administrative role without the leadership of men in their lives. Sarah Polk, the widowed slaver, was so dedicated to the Mississippi plantation as an investment that she prepared early for the loss to her holdings that she anticipated that the Civil War would bring. In a preemptive measure, she wrote up and sent to her overseer, now George Peel, a paper, quote, requesting all the troops of the federal army to respect and spare her property. She hoped that her standing as a former First Lady and her refusal officially to support the Confederacy would work in her favor. The overseer was supposed to present this official statement written up by Sarah Polk to any U.S. Army officers upon their arrival at the plantation. That did happen, but the gesture was in vain. The U.S. Army requisitioned provisions and mules, and in a hopeful effort meant to officially document the loss of her property in case of any potential later reimbursement, Sarah Polk had the overseer draw up a formal document listing not just the crops and other property, but the enslaved people who the federal army took with them. So the names are Silas, Perry, Lewis, Alfonso, William, Wilson, Andrew, Addison, and Manuel. By Peel's estimate, they were worth $20,000. This documentation that Peel provided was supposed to, because Sarah Polk understands the federal bureaucracy, this is supposed to gear her up to perhaps apply for reimbursement later on if the U.S. government saw fit to reimburse folks for property. The federal government is going to do this, but they will not reimburse slaveholders for the loss of enslaved people during the war. Sarah Polk applied to the Southern Claims Commission in 1871 for that other property. And so on the point of this sort of like post-Civil War business, there's another little tidbit I'll share here before tying this up. Leonidas Polk's sister, who married Susan Polk Rayner, who married Kenneth Rayner, they had a very bleak post-Civil War time. Kenneth Rayner had sent the enslaved people out to Texas to keep them, the enslaved people they held in Arkansas, he sent out to Texas to keep them out of the reach of the federal army during the war. When the war's over, this group of enslaved people write just this really like sort of sappy letter to Kenneth Rayner and say, oh, we want to come back home. Can you please pay for our transportation back home, okay, to Southeast Arkansas? And Kenneth Rayner did it. And as soon as they get back, he's ponied up, the cost to support them back to the plantation where they're now supposed to work for him, have agreed to work for him as free people. And they don't work very diligently by Kenneth Rayner's account. And so they kind of scammed him, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Kenneth Rayner's finances tank and he becomes depressed. And so what Leonidas's sister, Susan Polk Rayner, is going to do is she pulls from the little bit of Polk fortune that she's got left and buys her husband another plantation somewhere like outside of Memphis, and to like sort of cheer him up in these very sad post-Civil War years. And I say all that to say that this, with the Sarah Childress Polk information, really hits with some of the most recent scholarship on American slavery. I'm thinking in particular Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, They Were Her Property, what really emphasizes the cold, calculating nature that white women exhibited just as much as white men when it came to their role as slaveholders. So the Polks and their network, radiating often from Columbia, Tennessee, not only enriches our understanding of these launching pads of development of the plantation empire of the Old Southwest, but they're also an essential part of understanding the history of American capitalism. If, as so many historians recently have claimed, the roots of American capitalism are found in American slavery, then when you're looking at the Polks, you're looking at the web, the network that creates that system. And that's it. I'm gonna end this PowerPoint here. So I'm happy to take questions, and I will let you guys referee them, or I can poke into this Q&A box that I see and take a look.
Great. I think Clark, you're going to handle the questions. We welcome you to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Either way.
Yes, Dr. Jones, just a first question for you. So someone in the chat is wondering, how you were able to pronounce Leonidas Polk's name. If you could kind of talk about where you got that from, because they're saying they've heard it spelled and said differently.
How I'm pronouncing his name? I think Arkansans talk about him in terms of his role in the war, the whole like sort of fighting bishop business. And so I think what I'm probably delivering is, as I am so often, the Arkansas pronunciations that I picked up among folks talking about the Civil War and Arkansas. I have heard it pronounced in like 3 different ways, so.
Just speaking from my experience, some of the Polk descendants have taught me how to pronounce it, what they regard as the correct way.
Oh, right, okay.
Which is pretty much the way you say it. Mm-hmm. Can you say, I'll have a quick question here. Can you say something about the importance of these family networks, especially for credit, for generating and making credit accessible at a time when banks are comparatively weak institutions and unreliable, et cetera, especially as you're operating across great distances. It's a long way from Columbia to northern Louisiana, southern Louisiana, or Arkansas.
Oh, it's such a good question. That is one of the exciting aspects of what we're calling sort of like the new histories of capitalism and slavery. This close look at how people manage to finance these kind of things. And one thing about the Polks and folks like them is that they are really in this elite group where moving out away from population centers in the older, longer settled South isn't really hurting them when it comes to getting access to capital in the same way that it does people who have fewer connections and fewer to start with. So what I'm saying is that in the Cotton South, like in so many other places at the time, your kinship connections, your friendship connections are also your economic connections. And so you can more easily trade and exchange favors and be obligated to one another in favors that you do for people, but also like sort of trading resources. I'll send you this, you send me that. And then for the richer folks, actually borrowing money, from each other. The South is very cash poor. So one thing, that I probably should have pointed out a little more clearly is that this is very much the elite group of the South. This is not a typical thing that everyday folks are going to be able to do, is say that, oh, I have some kind of investment problem. Let me just shoot off a few letters, and then someone 2 states away, he's going to handle that problem, for me. And they're going to foot the bill because they know that I'll, be able to pay them back. Some of the scholarship shows that even within planter families, the ones who aren't as just sort of big and massive, and as rich as Polk and friends, it does become a hindrance for them the further they move from those like family home bases and the people they know. The more difficult it is for them to finance the kind of stuff that they want to do. And so everybody in this society is running in debt. It's just kind of the nature of agriculture, anyway. But the Polks and folks like them are much more able to tap into the resources of powerful friends and family to invest in things like new ventures, but also to buffer the sort of ups and downs of the market, considering, like you said, these financial system, the banking system's pretty anemic, when you compare it to, the North at the same time.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. There's someone in the chat, and they're asking if you've come across any examples or any evidence of religious life on within the enslaved populations on Polk's plantations.
The nature of the records that I have been using for this project don't lend themselves to that. I've used a lot of the James K. Polk correspondence, financial records, political letters, back and forth, census, tax, probate records. So those are the kind of things that hold that layer of life, fairly invisible. But that doesn't mean that it's not there. The mountain of research on the lives of enslaved people in the South overall show us that enslaved people have a rich and sophisticated religious life. They create their own understandings of Christianity, and it's often a subversive interpretation of the Bible and of what salvation means. So that's my sort of general cop-out answer, to say that the nature of the records that I've looked at don't show me that, but that is not evidence to like sort of prove that it didn't exist, because I would bet money that it did.
Thank you. So we have another question, and someone is asking, within the span of, the Civil War, were there enslaved populations that were sent out of reach when the Union Army was going into those different territories near the Polk kind of family plantations?
There are Susan Polk Rayner and Kenneth Rayner sending that group, the enslaved people that they held, out to Texas. Is the only specific Polk related example that I can think of right now off the top of my head, but it was very common for especially these big planters, because they, like we said, have the money, to do this, to really drive off enslaved people, send an overseer or send a couple of white men that and sort of guide them is away as far as possible from the federal army to keep them, from being freed. And that action in itself proves a good deal of agency on the part of enslaved people, because they know what the Union Army means, what the presence of the Union Army could mean for them. And so the best way for some of these folks to protect that investment is to just get enslaved people as far away as possible. So some they'll push them into, early in the war, they'll kind of push them into Arkansas. But then really, you're not going to get away from the Union Army unless you go into Texas. And that's an expensive proposition. So a lot of them don't make it that far.
Thank you. So we have another question. This one is especially relating to the Episcopal Church, and our attendee is wondering, what role does the Episcopal Church play in maintaining these kinship networks?
This is an easy one, because the answer is that I don't know that. I have only very recently, and it's only because of the Robertson Project, you guys getting in touch with me. Before that point, I had never really spent much time thinking about the Episcopal Church as an institution at this time. facilitating these networks. But if I had more time before my deadline for the editor of this UT Press compilation, I would be adding that. I would be looking into that and adding that in to enrich that, because I'm sure it's important. And so I'm gonna pause here and see if Woody Register's got something to add.
The I mean, Polk, when he was raising money for the university, used the network that he had established, with the organization of the Diocese of Louisiana. He used that and used the figures who were leading vestrymen in Episcopal churches all up, through the plantation regions of southern Louisiana, and then up around Shreveport and northeastern Louisiana. Those were the networks he worked, and the Episcopal Church was a kind of defined that network as Stephen Elliott, who is the Bishop of Georgia, claimed in his funeral address about Polk that Polk was sent to Louisiana because he was a planter, and that the Episcopal Church knew that he could walk shoulder to shoulder as an equal with the great money men of that state. And then he turns that relationship around to raise money for the university and for the great Episcopal Southern University. So at the same time, and Polk is quite sincere about evangelizing the enslaved population of Louisiana, determined to persuade planters to do that. So it's really the nexus in which he, and I think many of his fellow Polk relatives, worked.
Thank you. Our next question, so Dr. Jones, has your research led you into similar families with kind of the Polk kinship network that kind of made similar claims or deals regarding Mrs. Polk's kind of hope to secure reimbursement for her slaves, at the hands of the Union Army?
There are many Southerners who had been slaveholders who will apply to the federal government via the Southern Claims Commission for reimbursement of property that they lose during the war, but they're not allowed to ask for, and they'll get laughed out of town, for asking for reimbursement for enslaved people. But Sarah Polk didn't know that at the time. She's just kind of like thinking ahead. She's pretty smart when it comes to like business savvy. She's thinking ahead, like, hey, well, the Confederacy could fail, and when that happens, I want to be able to have this documentation of what property I've lost, during the war. And so other people have that kind of savvy too. But of course, the Southern Claims Commission is not going to even hear any sort of claims that, I want to be reimbursed for losing enslaved property. But the catch is, for people to apply, they've got to be able to prove that they had remained loyal to the United States during the war. Just any Southerner is not going to be able to apply for reimbursement from the federal government. They've got to be somebody who can prove that they had been loyal to the United States in the conflict, can prove what property the Union Army took, how much it's worth, and they've got to have people willing to, testify to that. But yeah, there's a lot of people who are hopeful. And now there is a rich record of white people suing each other after the war is over, based on conflicts over enslaved people as people as property in the pre-war years. So I mean, these people it's such a deep investment. They'll try anything, to try to recoup, what they've lost.
Thank you. And so we have another question in the chat. And so Dr. Jones, regarding your research, did you come across any living Polk descendants within your studies? And how, if so, how did that affect kind of the course of your research?
I have not encountered, well, James K. Polk did not have children. So there's no descendants of that, line, of the family that I've ever talked to. But when the University of Tennessee did their symposium capping off the years and years and years long project to edit, put together in one multi-volume place the correspondence of James K. Polk. They sort of cap off that project. They had a symposium where there were some descendants of Polk people at that time had attended. So not direct descendants, of James K. Polk, but descendants of other Polks. And I talked to a couple of them. By then I had done research, and they did send me to some additional places to look, as far as, some of these family connections, they can be sort of tricky. The folks who are doing that as genealogy are often, the ones who are most, well-versed. They have the most clarity on how these people relate to each other. I did also meet and talk to the descendant of Jack, the enslaved man who kept running away from Polk's Tennessee plantation to Arkansas. I was able to meet and talk to Jack's descendant, and we've emailed a little bit, since then. And my job is to just send him anything I can get that can tell him anything about his ancestors. And unfortunately, this record, it's just so slim. And I've gotten one other email from an African-American Polk, descended from enslaved people named Polk from, I think, Southeast Arkansas, who I'm sure has some, connection to this whole thing. So that's been very cool. That doesn't usually happen to me. So there's something about the Polk name. I don't know. There's something about when you find yourself researching really famous people, and then people sort of find you, you know what I mean, with some of these connections. So that's been pretty cool.
Thank you. Dr. Register, could you expand upon that? Has the project had any interaction with any of the Polk descendants? And how has that influenced any of the projects?
Very little. We had some when Joshua Rothman was here a couple of 2.5 years ago to give a talk about John Armfield. Some Polk descendants came for that talk. That's where I got the lesson on how to say Leonidas and not Leonidas. And they set you straight on that right off the bat. I think it was Rothman who got set straight, not me, that day. But no, but I would say that, excuse me, we have begun efforts to identify descendants of Leonidas Polks and Francis Polks, enslaved, the enslaved on their plantation in Louisiana. And we have not actually contacted anyone yet, but we have some good leads on that, and we're hoping to make those connections. One other thing I'll mention is that when Polk sold his plantation in, I think, 1854, the man who bought it, one of the reasons why we're having difficulties, we think he took the whole lot of his labor force to Texas at the outbreak of war too. So we don't know where that trail leads. One last question. Tell us briefly, if you can, the attraction of Arkansas in particular. It's a frontier region. It was organized as a diocese after Louisiana, and there are Sewanee connections with that as well. Tell us about Arkansas as a magnet for investment and in this period.
The interesting thing about it is that the thing that makes it seem really unattractive to some folks in the 19th century make it a magnet, for others. It is seen as a kind of wild, uncultivated place. And therefore the land is cheap. The land is very fertile. There is also room for young men who want to start up a political career. Maybe they can get started with the land office, work in one of the survey districts there. That's often, sort of a pipeline to a political career. They can start up a law practice out there and not have a lot of competition. So in addition to the cheap and fertile acreage, it's also sparsely populated enough that there's room for folks who maybe they've got a lot of good connections and they're just looking for, a fresh start. Maybe they've run into some trouble with debt in the past and they're looking to get out from under that. And so there are reasons that people will end up, out there. But it's a very, there's very stark economic inequality at the same time. I mean, besides the obvious, right, with like planters and enslaved people, but economic inequality between white settlers. Slaveholders will come in and snatch up the best land fastest. And at every, in every part of the state, even the Ozarks, okay, slaveholders are the ones running, the county government. They're the ones that have the most concentration of land. So it's just ripe for that kind of thing. And I think one of the things that makes it attractive for some of these investors is that it's overlooked. It'll get overshadowed pretty early on by Texas because there's just kind of this cultural draw that these folks have to, the idea of Texas. And even though Arkansas is right there, and it's not that different from East Texas, it's seen as a stagnant backwater. It's next to Indian territory. It's a dead end kind of thing. And so that leads some people to avoid it. But for some of these land speculators and folks who want to start up a political career in a place where nobody knows what they've been up to, it is rich with opportunity.
Right. Yeah, we're just going to mention somebody who's attending made an observation that at least 2 post-Civil War African-American legislators in Arkansas were enslaved by the Polks before the war. The Reverend Greenhill Jones was enslaved by Rayner, and Burns Polk by Andrew Polk in Phillips County.
Right. I bet that was Blake Winery.
It was. Is that a friend of yours?
I owe a lot of the sort of puzzle pieces that I've put together in this over the last few years when I first began on absentee slaveholding to Blake Winery, sort of, connecting some of these dots for me.
Very good. This has been a very good, very informative and very helpful and very pertinent talk for us tonight. Thank you for being so generous and sharing your scholarship. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this evening. So, and with that, we'll say good night.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Clark, do you know how to stop the webinar?